Buonasera a tutte e a tutti. Siamo molto onorati che Ellen Winner, professoressa emerita di psicologia alla Boston College University e Senior Research Associate a Project Zero, Harvard Graduate School of Education, abbia accettato l'invito a tenere un seminario per il corso di dottorato in Reggio Childhood Studies sul tema dell'educazione all'arte. Tale tema è al centro di un recente volume intitolato An Uneasy Guest in the Schoolhouse, Art Education from Colonial Times to a Promising Future, pubblicato dalla Oxford University Press. A nome della Presidente di Fondazione Reggio Children, Carla Rinaldi, ringrazio la professoressa Winner e porgo i saluti anche a Gigliola Venturini, Presidente di Istituzione Scuole Nidi d'Infanzia, che testimonia con la sua presenza la volontà di continuare sempre più la collaborazione tra due enti a Reggio e nel mondo. Il seminario sarà introdotto dalla professoressa Anna Maria Contini, direttrice del Dipartimento di Educazione e Scienze Umane dell'Università di Modena e Reggio Emilia, membro sia del Collegio di Dottorato che del Consiglio di Amministrazione di Fondazione Reggio Children, a cui lascio la parola.
Bene, grazie appunto al dottor Manera e sono veramente onorata di introdurre oggi il seminario della professoressa Ellen Winner, i cui lavori possiedono una grandissima rilevanza e sono molto noti a livello internazionale. Io mi limito qui a riprendere alcuni motivi del peculiare interesse che rivestono per me, in primo luogo, per il mio gruppo di ricerca e per il dottorato industriale in Reggio Childhood Studies. Quando ho cominciato a occuparmi della questione della metafora in ambito educativo e in particolare della comprensione e della produzione delle metafore nella prima infanzia, gli studi della professoressa Winner hanno rappresentato per me, così come per molti studiosi della metafora a livello internazionale, un punto di riferimento imprescindibile. A partire dagli articoli pubblicati negli anni 70 sulla produzione di metafore in età infantile, alcuni dei quali sono stati scritti da Ellen Winner in collaborazione con il professor Gardner e con altri collaboratori, emergono tesi fortemente innovative, ad esempio che sin dalla prima infanzia i bambini utilizzino espressioni metaforiche in situazioni di gioco, che poi sono state sviluppate ulteriormente nel volume del 1988 dedicato ai processi evolutivi di comprensione dell'ironia e della metafora. Quindi stiamo parlando del volume intitolato The Point of Words. Insomma, gli studi della professoressa Winner hanno aperto prospettive di ricerche inedite su un tema che oggi è diventato di grande attualità. Ma non dobbiamo dimenticare che negli anni 70 del Novecento si trattava di studi che erano fortemente innovativi, erano per così dire proprio pionieristici e che andavano anche controcorrente, in quanto si riteneva che solo dopo aver acquisito una piena padronanza del linguaggio letterale si potesse utilizzare il linguaggio metaforico, mentre invece gli studi della professoressa Winner mostrano che è possibile riscontrare l'uso di espressioni metaforiche sin dalla prima infanzia, quando ancora non c'è questa padronanza perfetta del linguaggio letterale. E comunque senza i lavori di Ellen Winner non esisterebbero, ad esempio, centri di ricerca come il nostro centro di ricerca dipartimentale su Metaphors and Narrative in Science. Ma le ricerche della professoressa Winner hanno affrontato altri temi di grande interesse per l'ambito sia estetico che pedagogico ed educativo. Con grande piacere la Presidente Rinaldi, il professor Zanetti ed io abbiamo presentato nel novembre del 2018 il volume How Art Works, come funziona l'arte, dedicato allo studio di temi cari all'estetica filosofica che la professoressa Winner ha affrontato intrecciando riflessioni provenienti dalla ricerca scientifica e psicologica. Ricordo con piacere che un estratto del volume è stato pubblicato su una delle più importanti riviste italiane di estetica, all'interno di un numero che ho curato insieme al dottor Manera, dedicato al tema dell'educazione estetica. Proprio all'analisi di questo tema è rivolto uno dei capitoli del volume che ho il piacere di introdurre oggi, intitolato An Uneasy Guest in the Schoolhouse, un ospite non facile nella scuola, che affronta la complessa questione dell'educazione artistica a partire dalla prima infanzia. Come ha scritto la Presidente Rinaldi, si tratta certamente di uno dei libri più appassionati, completi ed entusiasmanti sul tema dell'educazione all'arte. Il volume che la professoressa Winner ha dedicato alle insegnanti e alle pedagogiste di Reggio Emilia, oltre che ai ricercatori di Project Zero, affronta con efficacia il rapporto tra l'approccio educativo reggiano e l'educazione artistica, un tema di particolare interesse per le dottorande, i dottorati e i dottorandi in Reggio Childhood Studies, a cui è rivolto il seminario di oggi. Concludo salutando a mia volta la Presidente di istituzione, dottoressa Gigliola Venturini, la cui presenza ci fa grande piacere, e ringraziando la professoressa Winner a nome del Dipartimento di Educazione e Scienze Umane per aver accettato la proposta di condurre un seminario all'interno del nostro corso di dottorato. E le lascio la parola.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Very well.
You can now share your screen if you want to.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Contini, and thank you very much, Sandra Bertolini, for your expert translation. And thank you for inviting me here. I wish that I were with you in Italy, because Reggio is one of my favorite places in the whole world. But alas, I'm not there. So now I'm going to share my screen. Whoops, no, problem. Wait a minute, stop sharing. Hold on. Share screen, share screen. Nope, I'm trying to get it. Okay, can you see that?
Yes, yes.
Okay, good. Well, thank you for inviting me to talk about my new book on the history of art education. This is primarily about art education in the United States, but it does have a comparison to China, comparison to Reggio, and also a comparison to European methods of assessment, particularly in Germany and in Holland, which I won't have time to talk about today. The reason that I called my book this strange title, which, by the way, my publisher did not want me to use this title because the publisher thought nobody would understand what it meant. But I liked it, and so I insisted that that be the title. And it came from a quote by an art educator who said, "The arts, even art and music, are uneasy guests in the house of education, no matter how many field trips the fourth grade takes to nearby museums." Meaning the arts are always on the margins in the United States, and I believe in many countries, and my guess is it would also be true in Italian schools, except for not the Reggio schools. They're not considered the core of school. The core is reading and writing and arithmetic. And, you know, in the United States, people would say, well, yeah, everybody cares about the arts, but what do they have to do with school? And they are always on the sidelines. There's very little time for them, maybe one 40-minute session a week. And when budgets are tight, the arts are the first things to be cut. Sports are not cut, but arts are cut. Sometimes they're put in the after-school program, but not in the real school program. And we hear various justifications for the arts. Let me just stop and say, am I going too fast for Sandra? Can Sandra hear me?
Yes, she can hear, but she's translating, therefore you can't hear.
Am I going too fast?
Wait, I need to deactivate the translation. Okay, Sandra, now we can hear Sandra.
I can perfectly follow you. Thanks a lot.
Are you translating into Italian?
I'm translating simultaneously.
Okay, so tell me if I go too fast for translating.
Okay.
So in the 19th, I want to make a contrast between traditional approaches to art education and progressive approaches. That's the big broad contrast. And traditional art education is seen I'm going to illustrate it by talking about the 19th century in the United States, where the justification for art education was that it would teach people how to be really accurate in drawing so that they could grow up and work in the manufacturing industry and design tools. And the progressive approach to art education, which emerged in the 20th century as a reaction against the traditional approach, stressed very different kinds of justification. In the beginning, it was for the emotional growth of the child. But then by the second half of the 20th century in the United States, that changed. And the justification was it will help students standardize test scores. In other words, the arts will help them do better in math and reading. That unfortunately is not true. We showed this, that these claims feel good, but it's not the case that art education improves test scores in math and reading. And there's no reason why it should, because arts are teaching something very different. And then that led to a view of arts education as important for developing the habits of mind of the artist. And that is something that I was involved in writing about in our books called the Studio Thinking Approach. Here are two very different images of art education. Traditional on the left, progressive on the right. Every child on the left is doing exactly the same thing, and the teacher is telling them how to do it. A big no-no in progressive education. And in progressive education, you see on the right, students are inventing their own ways of drawing, and no teacher at the front is telling them how to do it. Ever since the 19th century, we have had a pendulum swing from the traditional to the progressive and back and forth. And I want to talk about that today. I want to illustrate the traditional approach by what I observed in China and what happened in the United States and in Europe in the 19th century. And it probably happened in Italy too. Drawing was treated as a highly rule-governed domain. And the teaching method was step-by-step formulas. First you do this, then you do that, then you make the line this way, then you make the line that way. And it was all based on copying. And in a way, it was failure proof. There was no way a student could fail because it was made so easy. This is some pictures of what I observed in China. This is how children were taught how to draw a goldfish, how to paint a goldfish, which is a traditional subject in ancient Chinese art. So over on the left, you have, can you see my cursor? Okay, you have the end state, whoops. And then right below that here, you have the beginning where the teacher showed how to begin the strokes. But most importantly, on the blackboard, you see what the teacher has drawn, and she has numbered each line so that students know which to draw first and which to draw second, etc. So that in the end, everybody's drawing a goldfish that looks very similar to everybody else's, and it also looks pretty professional. These are shrimp drawn by a 6-year-old, and you might think this was a very gifted child, but actually everybody in this first grade class had images that looked similar because it was taught in the same way. You have an image to copy, and you're told which line to draw first, second, third, etc. And you can't fail. These are chickens, and you can see that all of the chickens on the left look the same because everybody has done the same chicken schema. Children are taught that there's a right way and a wrong way. Here they're learning to draw penguins. And on the right side, you see two drawings of a body and a head. And here, a body and a head with a big X, because you're not supposed to do it that way. The head doesn't go like this, it goes like this. And here's the end state, and everybody does it the same way. And here on the left, you have a teacher actually taking the child's hand and helping the child to draw because the child wasn't doing it correctly. In China, you see the very strong influence of adult models. These on the top are images from children's newspapers that children see. And on the bottom, you can see children's drawings, and you can see how similar they are. The schema for the big head here, and the schema here for going under an umbrella from the back, copied right from here. And the assumption behind this traditional approach is we should teach the child the adult way. There's no point in letting the child struggle to figure out how to draw a goldfish. Just show them how to do it. Because what's important is the product, the final end state. The process of discovery is not important. So it's as if they were saying, we shouldn't reinvent the wheel. We've already invented the wheel, so let's just show the child how to do it. And this was really borne out to us when we were there with our 18-month-old son, and when we were in China, and we took the key to our hotel room down to the lobby every morning, and the key had a big wooden slab attached to it so that it wouldn't get stolen or lost. And every morning we were supposed to stick that wooden piece into a slot, like a mailbox, and it would fall in. And our child loved to do this, and he would take the wooden slab and he would try to get it into the slot, and it would take him a while before he turned it right. But the Chinese people observing us in the lobby actually came over and they took his hand and they turned it so that it would go in correctly. And I thought that was a good metaphor for the teaching method, which is show the child how to do it. Don't let him discover it by himself. And of course, in the West, from the progressive tradition, we think discovery by yourself is the way you learn. We see the same kind of teaching today outside of school in the United States. This is not how it's taught in school, but on the internet, you can teach your child to draw complicated things. Here's how to draw a robin. Each is a different step. You keep adding things to it, and they show you in a video on YouTube. Oops, whoops, hold on, I want to go back. How do I go back? Okay, so that's the end state. Down here, everybody can draw a bird that looks like that, just by step copying. Here's another example. You get down to this end state by starting with a very simple rectangle. And step by step you get here. Very easy. Sorry, I'm trying to make it go forward. I apologize. Okay, so what these traditional approach miss is giving any importance to the meaning for the child of what they're drawing, or the expression of feelings, nothing to do with beauty or aesthetics, and certainly nothing to do with creativity, because nobody's being creative, they're just copying. I actually did one of these programs with my 5-year-old granddaughter because it was during COVID and she wasn't in school she was staying home, and I actually, even though it went against my philosophy, I decided to do one of these little shows with her. And she created the fish on the left, which is actually really good for a typical 5-year-old. But then I looked back and I saw what she had done at 3 on the right, and that was a spontaneously drawn fish, no copying. And if you ask yourself which one captures the expressive gliding movement of a fish better, I think it's the one that's done spontaneously. The one on the left looks more detailed and more skilled, but the one on the right has something that the one on the left lacks. Now I want to say something about what happened in the 19th century in America and in Europe, because it's very similar to the Chinese approach. Napoleon created drawing as a part of the national system of the French education because he wanted to create people who could design tools for industry. This was really art for the lower classes. And the United States brought over this system from France and from England. And it was based on copying geometric shapes, like the ones on the right. The lessons were laid out in a strict order from simple to complex. And the justification again was designing tools to help the Industrial Revolution. And what this does is it teaches conformity, it teaches how to be precise, and it ignores anything to do with expression, individuality, and creativity. But the Industrial Revolution needed people who could draw tools, design tools, before computers. And I'm going to read you this quote, which was by somebody who wrote about what was happening in the 19th century. She said, "The end sought is not to enable the scholar to draw a pretty picture, but to train the hand and eye that he may be better fitted to become a breadwinner." That's how it was justified in the 19th century. A breadwinner means somebody that can earn money to support their family. So drawing was treated as a skill that could be learned, and anybody can learn drawing, and it's no different from learning to read and write. And to get parents to recognize the importance of drawing, you would hear things like this. This comes from John Chapman's American Drawing Book, which many families owned to teach their children to draw in this way. And he says, "But you say, I do not want my boy to become an artist. Depend upon it, he will plow a straighter furrow and build a neater and better fence." So you see the external justification for drawing. He will become neater, he will plow the fields better, he will build better fences because he's learned how to be precise. And this is what the director of art education in Massachusetts said. "In the schoolroom, the danger is strenuously to be guarded against of allowing drawing to be practiced for the mere purpose of producing pretty things." So you see how aesthetics is looked down upon. Now, in the 20th century, there was a strong reaction against this kind of mindless, rigid, rote learning. And this kind of rigid learning was not just in art, it was in all subjects. It was memory, memorize, memorize, memorize. Don't think, memorize. And there was a reaction against this. And in place of this, there was a movement towards child-centered learning and learning by play and learning by doing. And this affected all areas of the curriculum. And in a widely published and reprinted art education textbook in the United States, written by Victor Lowenfeld, there's a statement in there that's very surprising, or it would be very surprising to a 19th century art educator. The statement is, "It is much more important to develop creativity than competence in children." That would never have been said in the 19th century. And here, of course, is John Dewey, who developed progressive ideas into a complex philosophy. And he's the most important progressive thinker, and really started it all. And he said, "Give the pupils something to do, not something to learn. And the doing is of such a nature as to demand thinking, then learning naturally results. That's straight out of Reggio, in my opinion. Now, the progressive movement had its roots in Europe. There was Jean-Jacques Rousseau in France, who hated traditional education, thought that it corrupted children. There was Pestalozzi in Switzerland, who believed in hands-on learning. And there was Friedrich Froebel in Switzerland, who started the kindergarten movement and education through play. So that was before Dewey, but Dewey developed it into a complex philosophy. And then for art education, there were some key influencers, many from Europe. There was Franz Zizek from Austria, who started the child art movement. There was Henry Schaefer-Simmern from Germany, who talked about universal principles of art making from primitive art, child art, and adult art. There was Victor Lowenfeld, who I just mentioned, whose textbook, Creative and Mental Growth, went through 8 editions and had an extremely strong influence on how art was taught in American schools. Rudolf Arnheim, who was a mentor of mine, who came from Germany and came to the United States. And he was a Gestalt psychologist, and he wrote a great deal about art education from the progressive perspective. And finally, there was Victor D'Amico, who ran the art education program at the Museum of Modern Art. All very progressive thinkers. These brought progressive principles of education to art education. So I want to lay out for you 8 key ideas of progressive art education. Expression, okay, that's really important. The children are expressing their feelings through art, and drawing is a form of emotional growth. And everything children drew was supposed to connect to something meaningful to the child. So copying a geometric shape cannot be meaningful to a child. Children develop their own projects, unlike in Reggio, where children work together on a project that they all decide on. Each child did their own thing, and they were supposed to develop a topic that was of meaning to them. Arnheim wrote that capturing the feeling and the strength and the pride in an upright tree and the surrender in a drooping tree is more important than visual realism. So expression was super important. It didn't matter if your tree looked realistic. It mattered that you captured the feeling of the tree. This is a drawing by a child, and Franz Zizek taught this child, and he thought this was a fantastic drawing, but it was ridiculed by the other teachers who believed in teaching children to draw realistically. And he said, no, 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 look at the strength of these figures. They're as monumental as the Sphinx, as powerful as figures in a bas-relief of ancient Egypt. What rhythm there is in spite of their stiffness. So he really saw art in what children did. Another principle is that errors the children make have their own logic. And on the left, you see a fold-out drawing where the trees are folded out on either side of the pond. And on the right, you see the same thing in a Greek ancient fresco. Same kind of fold-out. See here, the trees folded out here. So realism is not the only way to draw. There are different ways. And the child's using a certain kind of logic here because he's making it clear to you that you can see if he had made the trees stand up like this, he would have obscured part of the pond. So the child is trying to make everything visible. And here's another example of a quote unquote error where the child has no unified point of view, because here you see the figures from the side, but you see the chessboard from a bird's eye view looking down. But look, the same thing was done in the 14th century. So is it really an error, or is it just a different way, a different system of drawing besides visual realism? Showing the invisible, another quote unquote error. Here's the child showing a pregnant woman, but here's Marc Chagall showing the same thing. So there are reasons for doing this. It's not an error. It's just not realism. It's not the case that in progressive art education, children were allowed to just do anything they wanted. It's not just anything goes. They were given challenging ideas for what to draw. And here are just a few examples. Draw yourself with a stomach ache. Draw yourself when you were most afraid. Draw what you saw on your way to school, et cetera, et cetera. So they didn't just sit down and say, okay, kids, draw. They gave them ideas for what to draw, but each child could choose their own, unlike in Reggio, where children work on group projects. Another key principle was individualized for each child. Again, I think that's very different from Reggio, but this was opposed. Do not teach everybody how to draw the same way. Individualize the approach for each child, whereas in Reggio, you don't have an individualized for each child because the children work together on a group project, but they develop the project themselves. They together with the atelierista and the teacher, but we'll get to that in a little while. Visual thinking is more important than copying. And this is from Rudolf Arnheim. And he showed how children drew a tree. And if you look, you can see the child has captured the hierarchical structure of the tree because you have a vertical trunk with smaller branches coming off that. And then you have smaller branches coming off those ones. And it really captures something about the structure of the tree, but it's not realistic. And Arnheim wrote, if you look at the bottom of the bottom quote on the right, creating this kind of structural equivalent is a far more intelligent act than the attempt to mechanically and mindlessly reproduce the tree as would a camera, which would be the 19th century copying approach. Process over product. And here I think this is very similar to Reggio. It's not the child's answer, but the child's striving towards his own answer that is crucial. Self-discovery. And you see the key in the key slot example on the right by using a typical child's toy where they have to fit things through slots. We think what's important is that the child struggle a bit until he figures it out on his own. Whereas on the left, you see the Chinese teacher actually moving the child's hand. So there's no discovery for the child. Now, I think I have 10 minutes left only if we leave 15 minutes for questions. I want to talk about the progressive approach in the Reggio Emilia schools. And here, of course, is Loris Malaguzzi, the founder. And of course, we all know about the 100 languages of children. And Loris Malaguzzi did say that children learn to think while they draw. And that's certainly true when they draw the Reggio way or the progressive way, but not when they're doing the Chinese way. There's no thinking there. So I said they don't call it art education in Reggio, but there's a lot of art education going on. But Lorenzo Manero, I'm sorry, I'm pronouncing you wrong. Lorenzo Manera has just written an article where he does say they call it art education. So I have to change this statement. But I couldn't find a lot of information on art education, but I saw art education being done. And this is a mural that some of you may have seen. I believe it's in the Diana School, and it's extremely sophisticated. And it was done by 4- and 5-year-olds. Look at how this person is drawn. Look at how the fish are drawn. Look at how the watermelon is drawn. And look at this upside down figure. And of course, it's upside down because children are working on this together and they're working on all different sides of this rectangle. Here, I just turned it right side up so you could see what an incredibly sophisticated profile this is. And this is the school assembly project, which some of you may have seen, where children were asked to draw the entire school assembly sitting in a circle. And they had to figure out how to draw people from the back and from the front and from the side. And they also had to do it in clay. So these are very, very sophisticated works. And they really shake up our assumptions of what young children are capable of. Because when American preschool educators look at these artworks, they say, how can this be possible? How can children do this? And I want to just tell you that I see 7 principles that make this possible. And these principles are consistent with the American progressive education, but in a way they go beyond them. So first of all, collaboration. There are no solo projects. That doesn't happen in most American classrooms. Each child is doing their own thing. Here we have critique, where the children are looking at each other's works. They're projected here, and they're talking about it, and they're helping each other. So here the child says, now I get it. If the leg is long, but it's bent, it can look like it's short. So she's figuring out foreshortening. So critique, which is a form of reflection, it's also a form of collaboration. And that's very important in developing the project. Close looking. There's a lot of observation in the Reggio classroom. And that's a way of overcoming stereotyped representations. So you can imagine a stereotyped way of drawing a flower, but if you look closely, it's much more complex than the stereotype. And that's what close looking allows these children to do. The projects go on long term. Most progressive art classrooms in the United States, unless they're Reggio inspired, kids make art in one session and that's done. And then the next week when they have art again, they do something else. But in Reggio, the projects can go on for weeks or even months. And the school assembly project is an example where they spent weeks working on it and then weeks more working on making it in clay. And here they are developing the project and talking about it among themselves. Remember, Malaguzzi said children learn to think when they draw. Children spent weeks of research for this project. They photographed people sitting from the side, from the back. They made sketches, they had critiques. When they worked in clay, they had to figure out how to make a person stand up and not fall down. And nobody showed them how to do it, but they talked to each other. And then the atelierista and the teacher asked them questions, but nobody told them what to do. They discovered it. The sixth principle is something I'm sure you've all heard: the environment as the third teacher. The beauty of the environment in the Reggio school struck me overwhelmingly when I first visited Reggio in 1982. Everything is laid out carefully with thought and is beautiful. Here are three just photographs that I took of a classroom where you can see the way the colors gradate, the way there's one that's all blue, there's one that goes from blue to green, there's one that's on the left that's all white. And there's a lot of use of light and mirrors and shadows and plants. They're just gloriously beautiful. I took this photograph a few years ago when I was in Reggio because a child saw a messy clump of sneakers and she arranged them like this just for fun. And I thought, this must have something to do with the environment where everything is beautifully laid out, because the child wanted to make everything beautiful. This was kind of just a spontaneous thing that I noticed. Nobody told the child to do this. Finally, documentation is really important, as I'm sure you all know. Documentation makes learning visible. No art is sent home to the parents to put on the refrigerator because no art belongs to an individual child. And so the message of documentation, which is displayed on walls and exhibitions and in books, the message is that what kids make and what they say about what they make really matters. I just want to show you this contrast. You have documentation on the left. This comes from an American Reggio-inspired school of children drawing a car, and it shows the whole process, and it talks about what the child said when he was drawing the car, and shows his thinking. And then the contrast is what you see in American homes, which is art stuck up a little bit carelessly on a refrigerator. There's nothing there about process. There's nothing there about care. It's just a little bit sloppy. And I have to say, I have been guilty of that, but I much prefer the careful documentation that we see on the left. And now I just want to show you a preschool child's drawing in America on the right, and the profile painting from that mural done in the Diana School that I showed you in the beginning, turned right side up. There's a huge contrast here because the American drawing is really much more stereotyped and simple. And the one on the left really shows observation of a profile. And I think that you get this kind of sophistication on the left because of the principles that I just outlined, particularly the importance of observation, whereas American kids rarely do observational drawing. Now, I was going to talk about how there was a revolt against progressivism in the United States, and I'm just going to talk very briefly. Elliot Eisner, that's a picture of him. He was upset because he said American children don't know anything about art. They're just taught the progressive methods. I gave them a test and they thought that Rembrandt was either Italian or French. They thought Picasso was an impressionist. They thought that Picasso and Matisse came in the 17th or the 18th century. They said that good art is just a matter of personal taste. They had no standards. And they thought that artists should paint pictures that people can understand. They didn't understand that artists are trying to push the boundaries and make people have to think. And he placed all the blame for this on progressive education. And he said, instead, we should have much more rigorous art education. And he's going back a little bit to traditional approaches. Kids should study art history, art philosophy, art criticism, and studio art making, but all in the 40 minutes that they have once a week for art. And of course, there was never enough time for all of these. So Elliot Eisner was trying to make children more culturally literate, but in doing so, he pushed people back to more traditional art education in the United States. There was a lot of criticism, which I'm not going to go through, of this approach. There was also some sarcasm. I'll just read you this because I think it's funny. Somebody wrote, I read the March 1988 issue of Art Education with a mixture of amazement and awe. In the article, Ronald H. Silverman outlined the democratic benefits of the Getty Foundation's program, that's discipline-based art education, which will, quote, train elementary classroom teachers in art history, art criticism, aesthetics, and studio production in 3 weeks. This is indeed an amazing feat, considering it takes us 4 years at this university to train competent art educators. Because Elliot Eisner thought that you could just take classroom teachers, not even art teachers, classroom teachers, and train them in 3 weeks so they could teach art history, art criticism, and aesthetics, as well as studio making. Ridiculous. Now, in the 21st century, I'm nearing the end here, so we can open it up for questions. We have a reinvention of progressivism. I'm going to skip this slide and tell you that here's the reinvention. We have art making as a form of interdisciplinary research. And I think this is very much like what goes on in Reggio. Here's an example. In the top picture, this is professional artists. It's called the Coral Reef Project. And artists crocheted forms that imitated the geometric mathematics of coral reefs. They researched the mathematics of coral reefs because coral reefs have a certain kind of non-Euclidean geometry where parallel lines converge. I'm not going to try to explain that. Take it from me that the coral reefs, to understand the structure of a coral reef, you have to understand something about non-Euclidean geometry. These artists researched that, and they used a mathematical code to crochet so that they could imitate the forms of the coral reefs. That's an example of a contemporary professional artist using research to create art. And it's interdisciplinary because it combines art and geometry. And then on the bottom, I have an example from a child. This child was in 5th grade and they were asked to study trees. And they went and studied giant redwood trees in California, which are enormous trees. And if you cut them, you see they have many, many, many rings, like all trees have. And these children were asked to keep research notebooks filled with their images and reflections. So they're doing science. But then she creates this work of art where each concentric ring is filled in with words and images about significant things that happened in her life. And to me, that's an example of doing research and combining science and art. Now, on the left, you have an example from a professional artist. This is the Chinese dissident artist Ai Weiwei. These are 90 tons of metal rods, and he made them from the mangled metal rods after an earthquake devastated schools because of bad standards. The government had not forced people to have good building standards. And so many children were killed. And this is a protest against that. And so he's challenging the dominant culture. And on the right, you have something that a child made in high school. This is a bird created out of the plastics that killed the bird. Both of these are forms of art which challenges something in the contemporary culture. And we also have, in the 21st century, children learning to make digital art, where you don't need any computer science expertise, because there are programs called, there's a program called Scratch, which some of you may be familiar with, and it's free. And it's just a matter of clicking, dragging, and dropping. And you can actually create things that move, that fly, that shrink, that change color, that make sounds. And this is how contemporary artists are often working today. So 21st century art education in the United States is trying to take contemporary art practice and get children involved in doing the same kinds of things as contemporary artists. So my concluding thoughts are that art education is still on the margins in the United States, and my guess is everywhere, except in the Reggio schools. It's still an uneasy guest in most schools. But I want to leave you with a quote from one of the founders of the United States, John Adams, who wrote, "I must study politics and war that my sons may have liberty to study mathematics and philosophy. My sons ought to study mathematics and philosophy, geography, natural history, naval architecture, navigation, commerce, and agriculture, in order to give their children a right to study painting, poetry, music, architecture, statuary, which means sculpture, tapestry, and porcelain." So if art education strives to teach children about the most important human inventions, I believe that education should teach children to learn about the most important human inventions. And the arts are one of the most important human inventions. And if we only teach children about science, then their education is half full. And so it's my hope, and all my career, it's been my hope to make art education more central, just as I want to make the psychology of art more central to the study of psychology, so that eventually the arts can give up their positions as uneasy guests and become fully welcomed permanent residents. And I want to stop here because we have 10 minutes left, and I should have left 15 minutes, but I'm now happy to take questions and talk to you all. So I'll stop sharing my slides.
Thank you very much, Professor Wiener. We might begin with some of the questions that the PhD fellows sent. So the first one was from Agathe. She, would you rather ask it yourself or should I read it? Oh, she's not, okay. So in your book, you write that a focus on personal expression has shifted significantly to a focus on big ideas and meaning. Not just personal meanings, but also social, cultural, and political meanings, which has led to an interest in getting students to make socially conscious art. Don't you think that forcing students to always find a social claim to their artistic work does not harm their creativity?
I completely agree with you. I never would think that children should be forced, never. I think that, and I don't know of any art educators who would argue for that. I think that what art educators would say is we want to show children that this is one of the things that contemporary artists do and give them that option. But I think that any art education that forced children to only make socially conscious art it's like putting an ideology, imposing your own ideology on children. And I would not favor that at all. So I think it's important to show children that this is one thing that contemporary artists are doing. because it might be something that they could connect to. But I'm
Thank
glad
you
you
very
raised that point. I don't want any ideology to be forced on children.
Then we have a question from Deborah, and she asks, the diversification of diversity or super diversity due to the movement of people is now part of our everyday world. Super diversity recognizes that we all influence each other's identity. That is ever evolving and fluid, and that is creating new groups, communities, and cultures. It also values horizontals as opposed to vertical power relationships in learning. I particularly valued reading about the 6 approaches which take 21st century progressive practices farther in chapter 11 of your book. Based on my research, I think they sit very comfortably with pedagogical approaches for the super diverse child. As teachers, the responsibility to examine our own social construct and understand that we all influence each other's identity has arguably never been more important in terms of supporting and bridging the uniqueness, belonging, and participation of the children in our care, including the skills of learning to negotiate our differences. So, Professor Winner, would you kindly share your thoughts relating to the importance of teachers developing an awareness of their own social constructs, particularly as this relates to really listening closely to the voice of the child, and especially in these times of increasing super diversity?
So I think that what you mean by super diversity has to do with racial and ethnic and cultural diversity. And of course, that has never been more important because every country is becoming more and more mixed because we're having more and more immigration everywhere. And that's a big concern in American classrooms, is how to get children to understand each other's culture. And I think what you're saying, though, Agatha, is that it's also important for the teacher to show his or her own positionality. Where do I come from? What kind of culture do I come from? I don't know whether schools do that very much in the United States. There's a big push on kids to talk about their own cultures. And I think that's very important. In the United States, in higher education, in colleges and universities, there is a big push for diversity of students and faculty. And that usually means racial diversity. It almost never means diversity of ideologies. So universities in the United States tend to be rather liberal. Professors are on the liberal end of the political spectrum. There are fewer conservatives than liberals. And some people say, well, we really should also, if we really want to have diversity, we should also have people on the right teaching our students. And some people say, oh, no, we don't want to have that because we don't believe in the right. But other people say, well, it's important because students should be presented with different points of view, because if you only get one point of view, you don't really understand the value of your own point of view. And it's important to be able to debate people who have very different points of view. So there's that kind of thing going on in the American higher education, but that's not so much going on in K through 12 education. But yes, I do think that Reggio has certainly had to deal with this because you've had so many immigrants come to your school, and I'm assuming that time is spent on talking about the culture that the children came from and getting the Italian children to understand something about that culture and getting the immigrant children to understand Italian culture. So I think it's a very important point. I hope I answered your question clearly, but if you want to follow up on it, please do.
Thanks. And so we have a further question from Camilla. And should I go ahead? Yeah. Okay. So how we will live in the future is the title of the past edition of the Biennale, an important and significant question that leads us to reflect under different and multiple aspects from the impact that climate change is having on numerous populations to the coexistence with different forms of living organisms and interactions with advanced technologies. Struck by concern, but also admired by the continuous discoveries and possibilities, I turn my attention to the children. How will the children live in the future? What do you think will be the life scenario inside the Reggio schools that you visited in the past years?
I have to say that that thought is something that haunts me, not about Reggio, but in fact about children in general and about my grandchildren. What kind of future are they going to inherit? And I don't feel good about thinking like this because I don't see a happy future because of climate change and the decline of democracy. So, but I don't think we can give up hope. We have to keep fighting against the two major threats to humanity, which are climate change and autocracy. So, of course, I'm hoping that the kind of education the Reggio children get, a very democratic education, will turn them into citizens when they grow up that will vote for democracy and not for autocracy. And I hope that progressive education in the United States will do this. This is why I think education is key to combating climate change and autocracy, because if you can think clearly, then you see what needs to be done. We know what needs to be done. We just don't have the will to do it. And so we need more people motivated to vote for the right kinds of political leaders who will lead us in the right direction. And right now, I know in the United States, everything is completely stalled because we have a Congress that wants to simply say no to every progressive idea that our president has. So it's very, very difficult times right now. And of course, with what's going on in Ukraine, it's just a total nightmare. So I worry about what our children will inherit, but we can't give up hope, and education is key.
Thanks. And Professor Wiener, can we take 5 more minutes of your time?
Of course, yes.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So we'll go on with some further questions. And in a chapter of your book at page 49, you talk about nature and the natural condition of children. And so the question is about what do you think might be an innovative strategy to stimulate children's natural aptitudes, if we can talk of children's natural aptitudes? Are
you talking about their natural? Are you saying how do we stimulate the innate aptitudes of children?
Yeah, the question referred to like a quote from your book where you write, nature and the natural condition of the child are good traditional forms of education, stifle and corrupt the child. And education must be reformed to let the child blossom naturally. And so, yeah, the question was, what do you think might be an innovative strategy to stimulate children's natural aptitude? But I think this question came from someone of the 37th cycle. Am I correct? So if you'd rather come up and ask it yourself, feel free.
Is somebody coming to ask it, or should I answer it?
I think you can answer, I would say, yeah.
Okay. That was from Rousseau, the French philosopher.
From a quote from Rousseau, sure.
Yes.
Yeah.
And Rousseau believed that the nature is good, the child is born good, and civilization corrupts. So I think that progressive education shares that view in a way. It's not, maybe not so extremely, but it does share the view that if you don't impose education on the child, but let the child, if you don't tell the child if you don't have the model of I'm going to feed information into the child's head, but you let the child discover things on their own, then what you're doing is you're letting the child's natural aptitudes take over. And the child is naturally curious, investigative. And if you provide a stimulating environment as in the Reggio schools, for children, they will bloom and they will make discoveries on their own. And what you see is their natural aptitudes coming forward, and they're actually have quite strong natural aptitudes. They're like little scientists and little philosophers. If you listen to what they say and the questions they ask, it's amazing how sophisticated they can sound. So I don't know of an innovative strategy. I would say progressive education and the Reggio approach are which are very connected, are ways to let the child's natural aptitudes develop.
Thank you very much. And there was a further question about teamwork, which you quoted during your presentation. So the importance of teamwork in the Reggio Emilia approach. And the question is about, is it desirable to educate children in teamwork and not in a competitive manner to form future citizens capable of making democratic choices? And maybe how important is that? We could add how important.
Very important. And when I talked about hoping that the Reggio children who are being taught in these very democratic schools, hoping that this will help them grow up to value democracy, I think I'm showing that I think that working together, collaborating together, not competing, but collaborating together, is crucial. And I wish that more schools did this. There is some push towards this in American schools, collaborative learning, but all too often it's individuals learning and competing with one another, which is, so I love the Reggio approach in art education, where students together discuss a project with the teacher and the atelierista, so they come up with a project that they all want to do. I'm sure they may not be 100% agreement, but there's majority rule. And then they teach each other as they're working. I mean, I watched this video of the children doing the class assembly project, where children would ask each other, well, how do I do this? And one child would say, I have an idea, let's try it this way. They try out things, they're experimenting, and they're revising their hypotheses about what works in collaboration with one another. So they learn that it's not that there's a teacher master on top who knows everything telling them what to do. They learn that they have their own capacities to do things. They actually are probably surprised by how much they can do. I bet you the children were actually surprised by what their classroom project looked like, of the assembly project, when they were done. So yes, for collaboration.
Thanks. Thank you very much. One last question we have received from our PhD fellows. It's about external exposure, meaning how does external exposure of children to art, for example, visit to museums or similar activities, influence their expression of art, creativity and imagination, and how important is that for children's education?
So this is one of the things that Elliot Eisner wanted to bring back. He wanted to have children studying great art of the past. And I think that is important. All too often, children in art class never see professional artworks. So they don't connect what they do to the art world. In the 21st century approaches that I was talking about, children are shown, they learn about what professional artists are doing, and they see their work. So I think it's important for children to be inspired. And I think it's important for them to connect what they're doing in school with what quote unquote real artists are doing. Just like I think when children study math, they should connect it to what real mathematicians do. And just a final point I'd like to make about this is that we've been studying drawing prodigies, child prodigies in drawing, who start out drawing extremely realistic at a very young age, without being taught. And one of the things I've noticed about these child prodigies is they often have no idea about the art world, and they don't go to museums. And my feeling is that I'm interested in the route between being a child prodigy and becoming a great artist. And I think the ones that are most likely to make that transition are ones who are hungry to see art by artists and who want to go to museums and look at art books. And I don't think that's true of all of them. So yes, it's important. I don't know how much of that goes on in the Reggio schools. But of course, all of Italy is like an art museum. Everything is so beautiful. You walk outside and you see the art of the buildings. So they're seeing great art just in walking to school, which is not the case in the United States.
So, and thanks for giving us some more time of yours. And I would like also on behalf of President Rinaldi to thank you very much for this seminar and to thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I hope next time it can be in person.
So thank you very much. We hope to see you soon in Reggio in person and to have this opportunity soon to to show you also our PhD office and to allow the PhD fellows to have the opportunity to meet you in person. So hopefully we will see you soon, and thanks again.
Okay. Thank you so much, Lorenzo. Thank you.
Grazie.